He was the voice of hope in a small Texas town, a preacher beloved by many, but behind the pulpit, he harbored a deadly secret. Women came to him for guidance, but never left. Reverend Mark Wallace, the man everyone trusted, turned out to be a serial killer hiding in plain sight. How did he manipulate his flock, and what made him prey on those who trusted him most? This is the chilling story of how a man of God became a monster. Stay with us as we uncover the dark truth that shocked an entire town. In the heart of Harlington, Texas, a picturesque town known for its rolling plains and tight knit community, Reverend Mark Wallace had carved out a reputation as a beloved spiritual leader. The small white chapel at the center of town was more than just a place of worship. It was a sanctuary for the troubled and weary, a refuge where people found solace in Wallace's heartfelt sermons. He was a man of charisma, with a deep, resonant voice that seemed to touch the soul of every listener. To his congregation, he was not just a preacher, but a confidant, a guide who helped them navigate life's challenges. Women, in particular, were drawn to him, often seeking his counsel during their darkest moments. Whether it was the weight of marital struggles, the grief of losing a loved one, or the burden of financial hardships, Reverend Wallace always offered a kind word and a steady shoulder to lean on. But as the months rolled by, a shadow began to creep over the town. At first, it was just whispers, rumors of women who had come to Wallace for help, but seemed to vanish soon after. These women weren't prominent members of the congregation. They were often outsiders, estranged from their families, or grappling with personal demons. Their disappearances were gradual and subtle, barely noticed by a community preoccupied with its own day-to-day struggles. To the casual observer, there was no connection, no reason to link these cases together. After all, people moved away, left to start over, or simply fell out of touch. But as the list of missing women grew, unease began to settle over Harlington. Despite the murmurs of concern, Reverend Wallace's standing in the community remained unshaken. His sermons continued to draw large crowds, and his reputation as a compassionate and devoted man of God seemed impervious to suspicion. Wallace was a master at cultivating trust, his calm demeanor and unwavering dedication to his flock disarming even the most skeptical. His ability to soothe the fears of his congregation only solidified his image as a savior in a time of growing uncertainty. When questions arose about the missing women, Wallace was quick to offer prayers and words of comfort, urging his congregation to remain vigilant, but not to lose hope. However, not everyone was convinced of his innocence. Among the doubters was Laura Simmons, a young woman who had recently joined the church with her close friend, Megan Carter. Laura had been struck by the way Reverend Wallace seemed to take a special interest in Megan, offering her private counseling sessions after church hours. At first, it seemed like genuine care, but as Megan began to confide in Laura about these meetings, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, Megan attended another one of these sessions, promising to call Laura afterward. That call never came. Days turned into weeks, and Megan was nowhere to be found. Laura's growing unease pushed her to share her concerns with the local authorities, but without concrete evidence, her claims were dismissed as unfounded. As the community grappled with the unexplained disappearances, the cracks in Reverend Wallace's pristine facade remained hidden. For those who adored him, he was the embodiment of hope and compassion. For those who doubted, he was a man cloaked in mystery, his true nature obscured by the trust he so effortlessly commanded. And for the women who had disappeared, he was a looming shadow in their final moments, a predator hiding in plain sight, exploiting the faith of a community that had placed him on a pedestal. Despite the growing tension in Harlington, Reverend Mark Wallace continued to stand at the pulpit each Sunday, delivering sermons that inspired hope and comfort. His words seemed to carry a divine power, offering solace to a community that desperately needed answers. With every heartfelt plea for unity and resilience, Wallace solidified his role as the town's spiritual cornerstone. He was a man who brought people together, reminding them to trust in God's plan, even as fear gnawed at their hearts. Behind his composed exterior, however, lay a carefully constructed facade that shielded his darkest secrets. While he preached redemption and compassion, he lived a double life, one that would unravel as whispers of his possible involvement in the disappearances grew louder. The police were inundated with missing persons reports, most of them concerning women who had been isolated from their families or were struggling with personal hardships. These women were the kind who slipped through the cracks of society, their absence often unnoticed until weeks or months later. Although there were murmurs among locals about the preacher's possible connection to these women, there was no hard evidence to back the claims. Wallace, after all, had been a beacon of light for so many, and to accuse him outright seemed unthinkable. He brushed off the rumors with the same grace and poise he used to lead his congregation, turning the scrutiny into an opportunity to strengthen his image as a man of unwavering faith. During this time, Laura Simmons, whose best friend Megan had vanished after one of Wallace's private counseling sessions, grew increasingly suspicious. She had tried to report her concerns to the police, but her words had been dismissed as baseless speculation. Determined not to let Megan's disappearance fade into obscurity, Laura began investigating on her own. She spoke to other women in the church who had attended Wallace's counseling sessions, piecing together troubling patterns. Many of these women described feeling uneasy around Wallace, noting how he seemed to target those who were emotionally vulnerable. But when it came to concrete evidence, Laura found herself hitting a wall. Wallace was careful, leaving no trace of his actions. The pastor's ability to maintain his innocence was bolstered by his profound skill in manipulation. He often used his sermons to subtly address the suspicions, painting himself as a victim of baseless accusations and a man under attack for doing God's work. His congregation, fiercely loyal, rallied around him, seeing the rumors as an attempt to tear down a man who had done so much good. Meanwhile, Wallace continued to use his charm to draw more vulnerable women into his orbit, offering private sessions that he claimed were focused on healing and redemption. As weeks turned into months, the missing women became ghostly reminders of the darkness that lingered in Harlington. Laura's persistence eventually led her to uncover something chilling, a journal Megan had left behind. Inside were notes about her private meetings with Wallace, describing an unsettling intensity in his demeanor. The entries detailed how he would often speak about sin and punishment, his words veering into a realm that made her uncomfortable. Armed with this discovery, Laura returned to the authorities, but it was still not enough to formally implicate the preacher. The lack of physical evidence continued to shield Wallace, allowing him to operate in plain sight. For the people of Harlington, the disappearances remained a tragic mystery. But for Laura, the clues were becoming impossible to ignore. The once revered preacher now appeared to her as a predator hiding behind the guise of faith. Despite the community's unwavering support for Wallace, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow responsible. As the town clung to its faith and the police struggled to connect the dots, Laura vowed to keep digging, knowing that the answers she sought could unravel a horrifying truth that no one was ready to face. The case took a dark turn when a hunter stumbled upon a gruesome discovery in the dense woods just outside Harlington. While scouting for game, he noticed a patch of disturbed soil beneath a cluster of pine trees. Intrigued, he began digging, only to uncover what would become the most significant piece of evidence in the investigation. Buried in the shallow grave were skeletal remains, later identified as two of the women who had vanished months earlier. The chilling find confirmed what many in the town had begun to fear. These disappearances were not isolated incidents. A predator was targeting women, and the quaint town of Harlington was now the epicenter of a murder investigation. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the community. The revelation of a killer lurking among them shattered the town's sense of security. Families locked their doors, women traveled in groups, and whispers of suspicion grew louder. For Laura Simmons, the discovery only fueled her resolve. She had always believed her friend Megan's disappearance was no coincidence, and now she felt vindicated. She doubled down on her efforts to connect the dots, revisiting her conversations with other women and piecing together their accounts. A disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that pointed directly to Reverend Wallace. The police, now armed with evidence of foul play, intensified their investigation. They interviewed anyone who might have been connected to the victims, including church members and townsfolk. Time and again, one name kept surfacing: Reverend Mark Wallace. Several women recalled attending his private counseling sessions, describing his demeanor as overly intense and at times unsettling. Though no one had definitive proof of wrongdoing, the consistency of their accounts raised red flags for investigators. Still, without concrete evidence linking him to the murders, they were left with only suspicions. Wallace, aware that he was under scrutiny, maintained his composure. In public, he continued to project an image of a wrongfully accused man, using his sermons to denounce the rumors and proclaim his innocence. He painted himself as a victim of a witch hunt, a man targeted for his unwavering faith and dedication to the community. His congregation, many of whom had known him for years, rallied around him, defending their preacher against what they believed were baseless attacks. Wallace's ability to manipulate public opinion was masterful, and for a time it seemed as though he might evade justice. But behind the scenes, cracks in his facade were beginning to show. Investigators obtained search warrants to examine his property and vehicle, looking for any connection to the crime scenes. A forensic team meticulously combed through evidence, focusing on fibers, soil samples, and other minute details that might tie him to the wooded area where the bodies were found. Their diligence paid off when they uncovered a critical clue, a bracelet belonging to one of the victims. The bracelet, found tangled in the carpet fibers of Wallace's car, matched one seen in photos provided by the victim's family. This discovery marked a turning point in the investigation. For the first time, authorities had physical evidence linking Wallace to one of the victims. While it wasn't enough to secure an arrest, it allowed investigators to zero in on him with greater intensity. They began piecing together a timeline of his activities, uncovering inconsistencies in his alibis and subtle connections to other missing women. The town, once firmly united in support of their preacher, began to fracture. Doubts crept into the minds of even his most loyal followers. The charm and eloquence that had once endeared him to the community now seemed sinister, a mask hiding something far darker. For Laura Simmons, the discovery of the bracelet was bittersweet. It brought her closer to uncovering the truth about what happened to Megan, but it also confirmed her worst fear. The man she had once trusted as a spiritual guide was capable of unimaginable evil. As the investigation into Reverend Mark Wallace deepened, Harlington found itself at the center of a media frenzy. Reporters descended upon the town, their cameras capturing every uneasy glance and whispered conversation. Once celebrated as a peaceful haven, the community now carried the weight of a chilling mystery, its residents caught between loyalty to their preacher and mounting suspicion. Wallace maintained his calm demeanor in public, using the attention as a platform to reinforce his innocence. He called for unity in his sermons, praying for justice, and urging his congregation to stand strong in the face of adversity. But beneath the surface, the pressure was mounting, and cracks in his carefully constructed facade began to appear. The police focused their efforts on building a case against Wallace. Detectives pored over his financial records, phone logs, and personal correspondence, looking for anything that could link him to the missing women. A search of his home yielded unsettling findings, journals containing cryptic notes about sin, redemption, and punishment. While not direct evidence, the writings painted a disturbing picture of a man with a deeply warped sense of morality. Additionally, investigators discovered keys, pieces of jewelry, and other small items that, upon further analysis, were tied to the missing women. Each new discovery brought them closer to understanding the scope of Wallace's crimes. Meanwhile, Laura Simmons became an unlikely ally to law enforcement. Her relentless pursuit of the truth, fueled by the memory of her missing friend Megan, provided detectives with valuable insights into Wallace's behavior. Laura shared her findings, including accounts from other women who had interacted with the preacher. She also turned over Megan's journal, which contained chilling descriptions of her last meetings with Wallace. Megan had written about feeling trapped during their sessions, describing how Wallace's comforting demeanor would occasionally shift into something predatory. The journal entries were filled with Megan's growing fear and a sense of foreboding that she couldn't fully articulate. As the investigation progressed, the town's support for Wallace began to waver. Once loyal parishioners struggled to reconcile the evidence against him with the man they had trusted for years. The air of doubt grew thicker with each passing day, and the congregation's numbers began to dwindle. Wallace, sensing the shift in sentiment, grew more desperate. His sermons became increasingly erratic, filled with fire and brimstone rhetoric that unsettled even his most devoted followers. What had once been a place of comfort and hope now felt oppressive, the weight of his hidden deeds tainting the sanctity of the chapel. The turning point came when authorities received an anonymous tip about a secluded property owned by Wallace on the outskirts of town. The tipster claimed to have seen him frequenting the area late at night, often carrying large bags. Armed with this information, investigators secured a search warrant and descended on the property. What they found there was beyond anything they had anticipated. The property was a sprawling, overgrown lot, hidden from view by a thick grove of trees. In the center stood a small, dilapidated shed that reeked of decay. Inside, investigators discovered a macabre collection of items, a blood-stained tarp, tools that appeared to have been used for dismemberment, and, most disturbingly, a diary detailing Wallace's crimes. The diary was a chilling account of his exploits, written in meticulous detail. It described how he chose his victims, lured them in, and carried out his heinous acts. With this discovery, the weight of evidence against Wallace became undeniable. The town of Harlington was in shock, its once beloved preacher revealed as a cold and calculating predator. For Laura, the discovery brought her closer to justice for Megan, but it also left her grappling with the horrifying truth about a man she had once trusted. As Wallace's world crumbled around him, the community was left to pick up the pieces, their faith shaken and their trust forever broken. The arrest of Reverend Mark Wallace sent shockwaves through Harlington and beyond. The once revered preacher, whose sermons had been a source of inspiration and comfort, was now in handcuffs, charged with multiple counts of murder. The town's idyllic image was shattered, replaced with a grim notoriety that drew the nation's attention. Reporters swarmed the courthouse as Wallace was escorted inside, his head bowed, but his expression eerily calm. He maintained his innocence, even as the evidence mounted against him, insisting he was a victim of false accusations and a smear campaign. But behind the walls of the county jail, the truth of his monstrous double life was slowly coming to light. Investigators worked tirelessly to build an airtight case, knowing the magnitude of what they were dealing with. The diary found in the shed provided chilling insights into Wallace's mind, detailing not just his crimes, but his twisted justification for them. He saw himself as an agent of divine will, punishing women he deemed immoral or unworthy. His victims, many of whom had come to him in search of solace, were instead met with unimaginable terror. Wallace's diary revealed a methodical approach to selecting, luring, and ultimately murdering these women. He preyed on their vulnerabilities, offering them kindness and support before turning their trust against them. The trial began amidst intense public scrutiny. The courtroom was packed with reporters, townsfolk, and families of the victims, all eager for justice. Prosecutors laid out a devastating case, presenting physical evidence, forensic analysis, and witness testimonies. Items found in Wallace's possession, including the bracelet from his car and the blood-stained tools in the shed, painted a clear and damning picture. The prosecution also read excerpts from Wallace's diary, which left the courtroom in stunned silence. His detailed confessions and self-righteous musings revealed a man who had hidden behind the guise of faith to commit acts of pure evil. Laura Simmons took the stand, her testimony becoming one of the most pivotal moments of the trial. She recounted her friendship with Megan Carter, her suspicions about Wallace, and the relentless search for the truth that had led her to uncover key evidence. Her words were filled with both pain and resolve, as she spoke not just for Megan, but for all the women whose lives had been stolen by Wallace. Her bravery in confronting the man who had caused so much suffering earned her the admiration of many, but it also underscored the horror of what had unfolded in Harlington. Wallace's defense attempted to cast doubt on the evidence, claiming it was circumstantial and that the diary was fabricated. He portrayed himself as a victim of persecution, a narrative he had used successfully for years. But this time, the facade couldn't hold. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through his manipulations. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts. Wallace was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never harm another soul. As the gavel fell and the courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and grief, the people of Harlington began the long process of healing. The chapel that had once been the heart of their community was now a haunting reminder of the betrayal they had endured. For Laura Simmons, the trial's conclusion was bittersweet. While justice had been served, it couldn't bring Megan or the other victims back. Yet she found solace in knowing that Wallace's true nature had been exposed, and his reign of terror had come to an end. In the aftermath, Harlington struggled to reclaim its identity. The scars left by Wallace's crimes ran deep, but the town vowed to honor the victims by ensuring their stories were never forgotten. For Laura, the experience left her with a profound sense of purpose. She dedicated herself to advocacy, determined to shine a light on the dangers of blind trust, and to prevent others from falling prey to predators like Mark Wallace. Though the town would never be the same, its resilience and determination to rebuild stood as a testament to its strength, even in the face of unimaginable darkness.